I'm based in France. Sorry for the accent. I hope it's understandable. And I'm the Deputy Director of the Digital Revenue Network at WAN-IFRA. So I will be moderating this session and the next one this afternoon. So just a little bit of logistics. We will take questions at the end of the presentation, and please add them in the Q&A box. I also would like to thank Piano, who's the sponsor of this session, and we thank them for their support for their the organization of this conference. So the session. Professor Rasmus Nielsen, our speaker in this session, is very well known in Europe and maybe in India too. I don't know if it's probably not the first time you speak in India, Rasmus. He's the director of the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism and a professor of political communication at the University of Oxford. I must say that I'm a regular reader of the reports published by the Institute, and of course, one of them is particularly popular among industry professionals. It's a digital news report, which studies 46 countries. Since last year, India has been included for the first time in the survey. So this is very exciting to see what you have to say about the India digital story. And so I will hand to you, over to you, Professor, and for this presentation about the Reuters digital news reports and some takeaways for South Asian news publishers. Yeah, there you go. Sorry.
Thank you very much, Valerie, for the kind introduction, and thanks to the organizers, WAN-IFRA, Digital Media India, for the invitation to speak. I look forward to resuming my regular trips to India when such things become possible again. But meanwhile, I'm very glad to be able to join you virtually. So what I want to do today is to highlight a few of the global trends that we have documented in the last edition of the Reuters Institute Digital News Report, and then bring out some of the specific things we have found in the Indian market that either illustrate the same trends or illustrate some of the differences between the Indian market and other markets. I'm going to share some slides to give a sense of this, and then I look forward to any question towards the end of the presentation. So the digital news report, for those who are not familiar with it, is the world's largest ongoing study of news and media use. We covered last year 46 markets on 6 continents with samples of 2,000 users in each country or market. And we've been doing this report now 10 years in a row. So it does help us also, I think, capture sort of trends over time in many parts of the world, both similarities and differences. The survey is an online survey, so I should stress that the data is about internet users, which of course in a market like India still doesn't include the whole population. And I should also stress that while respondents in India could respond in Hindi, the panel is recruited in English. So this is representative of English language internet users in India and not the whole population. So a small and important part of the population of the market, but not the whole population. The report is made possible by support from a range of different sponsors, including media organizations such as the BBC, foundations such as the Open Society Foundations, media regulators, media industry associations, universities, and a large grant from the Google News Initiative. I want to start with something that by now in some parts of Europe feels sort of like a long time ago, but was very visible in the data we collected in early 2021 for last year's edition of the Digital News Report, which is the impact of the pandemic on how people use news and think about news. And I think it sort of illustrates some important dynamics in media markets. What we found across the world was a significant uptick in trust in news as people turned to news media for important and useful independent information in a time of crisis. And no similar increase or really change at all in trust in news found via platforms such as search engines or social media. And that means that what we call the trust gap between news in general And then news found via various digital platforms actually increased during the pandemic because of this increase in trust for the news media. Now, of course, this varies quite a lot from country to country, how many people say they trust the news, or indeed how many people we might think should trust the news. And for India, I would just highlight here that the sort of figures are about the global average, and we see no change since we did a pilot study in 2019 in terms of trust in news in India amongst English language internet speakers. It's also, I think, interesting to look at the breakdown by news overall, news I use, and trust in news found various digital platforms in India, where there are sort of two things to highlight that are distinct for the market. One is that, as in many polarized societies, the gap between trust in news overall and trust in news that I personally use as a respondent is quite significant. And the growth in trust was primarily in terms of trust in news I use, so people's own preferred sources. The other thing I think is important to highlight about India is that the trust gap is much smaller than in many other countries. There is relatively higher trust in news found via search engines and social media in India than in many other countries, and a much smaller gap between news in general and news found via platforms, perhaps in part because of different demographics, where many young people in India, if they have internet access, have grown up familiar with the experience of finding news online and less familiar with going direct to news brands. Now, if we look at individual brands, what we see in India is that the most trusted brands are those who are widely used, often national newspapers. Is very similar to what we see in many European countries, where, again, similarly, it's essentially brands that many people are familiar with and that are often seen as sort of providing journalism that they would say is impartial or straight, if you will, and that critics might regard as sort of he said, she said forms of false balance. But again, familiarity and reach seem to be key drivers of public trust in individual brands of providing news. Now, trust, of course, is important in itself. We all want to be trusted for our work, but I think it's also instrumentally useful. At least we find in our research that when we look at the online reach and the change in online reach of individual brands from 2020, before the pandemic really hit much of the world, to 2021, when we collected data from last year's edition of the report, more highly trusted brands tend to have done better at growing their online reach than less trusted brands. So trust, I think, is intrinsically important, but perhaps also instrumentally important and a business opportunity for those brands who have earned people's trust and are able to retain and renew it. Part of the backdrop here, of course, is concern about misinformation, which has been a very real issue on digital platforms, but also, of course, sometimes from prominent politicians or other public figures, or indeed some news media. When we look at India specifically, the topics that people say they've seen online misinformation about is COVID and politics, and primarily also some other issues, but these are the two that loom large. And when we ask people about the sources that they are most concerned about misinformation about COVID from, there is a lot of focus on politicians, but also, of course, concern about the sort of proverbial uncle forwarding something on WhatsApp that may not be particularly credible and might even be dangerous to take seriously. When we turn from sources to platforms, it's very clear that Facebook as a company is really sort of the primary entity that people are concerned about across the world. And the main thing that varies from country to country is which part of what's now called Meta that people are most concerned about. So in many countries in Western Europe, it's Facebook, it's Big Blue, the Philippines as well. Whereas in much of the global south, including India, WhatsApp actually comes out ahead in this rather unedifying race of being the platform that the plurality of respondents say that they're most concerned about misinformation from. But again, of course, another entity that's owned by Meta. Now, I think from the point of view of publishers, of course, it's very satisfying to see trust increase, at least for some brands, in a time where people rely on your news to make life and death decisions and understand the world around them. And of course, also very satisfying to see that trust may help drive reach. But I think there's also a question of whether trust can sort of increase revenue. The backdrop here, of course, is a world in which, as audiences migrate online, and primarily spent their time and attention with big platforms who can offer cheap targeted advertising at scale. Advertisers are in turn flocking to the platforms and challenging advertising reliant business models amongst traditional publishers in particular. So many are turning to reader revenue to see what potential there is there. Our data in India, I would say, is mostly here interesting for the suggested willingness to pay in the future. Paying for news online is still incipient in India. So I won't speak to the India data specifically, though I know there's been very, very significant growth in other digital subscription services in India, most prominently probably subscription video on demand, with I think a reported 100 million subscribers now. And instead, say a few things about the dynamics we see in markets where digital subscriptions by now have begun to mature as a part of the business of news. So what we see is that we see some growth in high-income markets across the world, in particular in the Nordic countries, where by now about a quarter of internet users say they have paid in some form for online news in the last year. But it's also important to recognize that in many parts of Europe, for example, there's been little progress still, and it's a small minority, 10% or even less, who say they paid for online news in the last year. And I think we can all understand individually why that might be. These are just a couple of quotes from some of our qualitative research, where a young woman in the UK who says that, news is literally everywhere, so she doesn't really see the need to pay for it. Or an older focus group participant from Germany who feels he can get all the information that he needs with the aggregator app that he uses, so he doesn't really see the need for any subscriptions. From the point of view of much of the public, there is perfectly satisfying and acceptable, free at the point of consumption news available from a plethora of sources, including many publishers, whether newspaper publishers, commercial broadcasters, public service media, online-only entrants, or others. And a lot of news, of course, remains freely available, and many people are perfectly satisfied with what they can access in that form. Now, of course, there are publishers who are really doubling down on subscription as part of their business model anyway, and I'm glad to report that we see very significant success for a number of titles in the United States, some individual titles in the UK, and also, of course, in the Nordic countries. Now, the dynamics of these markets, I think, are important to recognize, which is that in most markets, not all, but most markets, we see very strong winner-takes-most dynamics, where newspaper markets historically were differentiated by geography, with different titles dominant in different parts of the country, increasingly on national, with a few often upmarket national titles accounting for half or nearly half of all the digital subscriptions. Very, very different market from what we've seen offline, where geography really mattered. And this is very, very different in the online markets, with some exceptions. In Norway, we see local titles doing quite well. About half of those who say they pay for online news say they paid for at least one local title. But in the UK, it's just 3%. And in the US, which historically, of course, was primarily a local and regional newspaper market, with a few prestigious elite national titles, but with limited subscription circulation overall, today, increasingly, in terms of pay at least, is a national media market. When we ask people about why they are subscribing in this world where they have access to so much news and information for free, there are a number of different motivations people offer in the qualitative research. Some people highlight values, that they believe in the values that journalism and news organizations represent. There are, of course, people who are convinced by sort of a good offer. In this case, it's a very cheap trial subscription offered by Swedish newspapers by a woman who responded there. There are people who deliberately say that they pay to expand the horizon of news and opinion that they have access to. And then there are people who say that they subscribe to supplement the breadth that they might get for free with the depth provided by some individual titles. So these are different value propositions. I think publishers can think about what might be the one that they can most credibly offer in a very, very competitive market. Now, one of the values that many associate with the news is sort of impartiality, though, of course, we also see more and more organizations sort of take a stance and demonstrate moral clarity on some of the issues that divide us. We have a set of questions around this that I want to go through quickly just to give you a sense of the responses both globally and in India. On the question of whether news outlets should reflect a range of different views and leave it up to people to decide, or should argue for the views that they think are best, we see a very clear majority amongst our English language internet using Indian respondents for a fairly conventional notion of impartial news that reflect a range of different views and leave it up for people to decide. We see a less clear, but still predominantly a similar view when it comes to the question of whether outlets should try to be neutral on every issue, or whether there are some issues where it makes no sense for outlets to try to be neutral. So a more even split here, but still a plurality, nearly half of respondents who say that outlets should try to be neutral on every issue. And when we turn to the question of whether outlets should give equal time to all sides of an argument, or should make a clear and explicit editorial decision to give less time to sides they think have a weaker argument on a divisive issue, again, a clear majority in India of our English language internet respondents say they feel outlets should give equal time to all sides. So I think this is an important a complement to the sort of very public demands for more clarity and news organizations taking a stance. There is clearly a significant minority in the public who wants this, and it might be right, either from a principle point of view or for some brands from a pragmatic point of view as well. But I think it's important to remember the backdrop here is that a majority preference for news that people see as impartial and neutral. Where might people then get this? In terms of the online environment, for some years, we've seen the growth in the role of platforms as intermediaries. When we look at this globally, we've seen the sort of gradual move from a world in which, of course, most people get news online in many different ways, but when we ask the follow-up question, what is the main way in which you get news online? By now, it's just 25% of our respondents globally who say that going direct to a news site or news app is their main way of getting news online. And a majority rely on various forms of site door access through social media, through search engines, aggregators, and the like. And this trend is far more pronounced amongst respondents under 35. Now, when I look at our Indian sample, this pattern is even more pronounced. And it's just 12% of our respondents in India who say that the main way in which they get online news is going direct to a news site or app, and a much greater reliance on social media and search and aggregators and other forms of site door access. So I think we can sort of really see in a way here, perhaps a case where the Indian market is ahead of Western markets, where many, in particular older people, are still primarily discovering news also online directly, not so much for the younger people and not so much in a market such as India. Now, of course, this is happening in a context where the platform ecology is changing. We see in our data, no evidence to suggest a decline in the overall number of people who use Facebook, for example. But when it comes to news, it's very clear that there's been a steady decline in the number of people who say they get news while using Facebook, often primarily for other purposes, even as other platforms have become more important. Incremental growth for YouTube, growth for WhatsApp, very, very big growth in India, of course, but these are global figures, sort of stable, low levels of use of Twitter, and then quite rapid growth in more visually led social media, Snapchat, TikTok, Instagram, which are very important amongst younger demographics across the countries that we look at. I want to end then with a question of who people say they pay attention to in these more distributed environments, and some interesting differences we document from platform to platform. First, the motivations of why people use these. I mean, I think we really need to recognize as publishers that it's only a small number of people who get news on platforms because they go there to get the news. When we ask people about why that they have used a certain social network for news, Twitter is actually the only one where a plurality, and even there only 25%, say that they get news on Twitter because they feel it's a good place to get the very latest news. And when we look across all the other platforms we have good data on, the plurality will say that they get news while using the platform for entertainment. It's a fun and entertaining way to pass the time. It's the dominant response for YouTube and Instagram and Snapchat and TikTok. Or that they get news while they are using the platform for other purposes, primarily staying in touch with friends and family and acquaintances. This is sort of Facebook and to a significant extent Instagram as well. So people get news incidentally in a lot of these platforms, but it's not the primary purpose of why they use the platform. And news in that way sort of comes in the slipstream, the current, behind the other activities and motivations that people have for using different platforms. Who do people then say that they pay attention to on them? On the sort of older platforms, if you will, Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, those that have been around for quite a long time, and who also often have a user base that includes sort of more people towards the older end of the demographic. You'll have about a third or a quarter of the respondents say that when it comes to news, they pay most attention to mainstream outlets and mainstream journalists on these platforms. Of course, that still leaves a majority who pay attention to other sources. And if we then turn to more visually led social media, often younger companies or younger platforms and with a younger demographic, it's generally personalities, individual creators, influencers, celebrities, and the like that a plurality of our respondents say they pay most attention to. So a very different way of thinking about how one navigates an information environment. And one I think that publishers are only beginning to come to terms with the question of what their role might be in such a changing environment, given how people navigate it. So just a few emerging questions to end with, and then I look forward to questions for those of you who have taken the time to join this panel session. I think it's clear that the coronavirus accelerated digital change. Print circulation has fallen off a cliff in countries where it was already often declining or stagnant. This has benefited a few winners, most notably the platforms, but also some publishers who were well positioned and able and willing to invest in this, but also put further pressure on traditional models and traditional funding models. I think there is a question about how news media can build on the trust premium that some gained during the pandemic. Can we retain this? Can we renew this? Have we learned something we can use going forward? There are certainly some questions about how far pay models can go in India, where, as said, we've seen extraordinary growth in the last 5 years in many forms of digital subscription, but perhaps less so far in terms of subscriptions for digital news, specifically in India. There are, I think, questions here about how publishers can strike a balance between impartiality and moral clarity in divided societies, and different publishers will want to and should make different choices, and different parts of the public want different things. And then a question, I think, of how to engage with younger audiences who seem to prefer social and other platforms and often follow individual creators rather than established brands, also when it comes to navigating news online. So with that, thank you very much. All the underlying data and research is available on the Reuters Institute website. So I hope it's useful for you, and I look forward to questions from those of you who've joined the session.
Thank you very much, Rasmus. So just a first question, so we have a few questions here. Just one from me about how to engage younger audience, the last part of the, I was wondering if during this COVID period, you've seen some interesting cases of news media engaging with young readers on social platforms, not like trying to, because that could be also some cases for India.
Thank you. Yes. So first of all, I'd say that in the countries where I've seen more granular data, it's clear that many young people have turned to established news media that they know and trust in situations where they felt that this met needs that they have. So for example, the BBC here in the UK, but also newspaper publishers such as The Guardian and others have seen huge upticks in their audience, including young people during the pandemic. What I think is really important to keep in mind is that the uptick is driven by people's need and their perception that publishers can meet that need. And when the need subsides, the audience will subside as well. And there is really no reason to believe that people who have come just for the COVID information will necessarily come back for the politics if that never attracted them in the first place. So that, of course, raised the question of whether publishers can sort of meet people where they are, which is often on the platforms. And we all know and need to very explicitly recognize the commercial challenges around that. In the absence of sustainable funding models for doing that, then many publishers will not be particularly interested in going all out on free reach. But there clearly are opportunities, and we are seeing publishers, both commercial and public service, use platforms such as TikTok and Instagram to reach audiences who are very unlikely to come directly to their news sites. But it is a serious commercial challenge how to make that sustainable. And that's a challenge I think that the platform companies also ought to think about how they avoid a situation in which quality publishers have no incentive to make their material available, and lots of other actors rush in, and not all of them necessarily sources that we may want people to turn to. So, I think there are some very clear opportunities, but commercial sustainability is a precondition of independence, and we need to think about the business models as well as the question of whether we can reach people.
Yeah, I mean, if only it helps bring back these younger audiences to the main news brand. There's an opportunity, even if you have to offer for a while some free news, but if they come back to the platform, to the news platform. So let's go to our questions. So yes, I think that was a question that when you started the presentation about the reason why there wasn't so much gross interest in Indian media compared to other countries. So you mentioned the social media and the young demographics in India. So maybe you have some compliments.
Yeah, I mean, I think we need to keep in mind that trust is driven by many different factors. Some of them are well understood in social science. Others are things we're only beginning to understand. So I mentioned some of them in the presentation already. Familiarity is very important. So, in that sense, reach can actually help, accustom people to the value of your news. Utility, do people find that they can count on the information that they find? Is it credible from the point of view of the needs that they have? I think the thing that often sort of complicates this is politics. In very polarized and divided societies, people will take elite cues for whether they should trust the media or not. And they will also sometimes judge the media on how the media treat politicians that they have sympathy for. So, India is obviously a society in which there's a pretty strong disagreements on some issues, and people who might support the ruling dispensation may not be particularly appreciative of organizations that try to cover them very independently and very aggressively and sometimes quite critically. And similarly, of course, people who may have reservations about Mr. Modi and the current government. And what they're doing may feel that some news organizations are being insufficiently independent and not actually aggressive enough in their coverage of what is going on. So we know that politics and polarization erodes trust in the news media, and I suspect that that's probably one of the factors in India.
Yeah. There's another question, but I don't think you can really answer this one this year, probably next year. It's about the willingness to pay on the Indian market. But if I don't think you have enough, maybe history but your knowledge of the market might help.
I mean, I think that given how much news is available for free, much of it from perfectly legitimate sources. My general position is that people paying for news has to start with publishers trying to charge for news, and really betting on that strategy and making sure that they have the long-term commitment to building up a base of subscribers and making sure that they actually create value for them so that they can retain those subscribers and continue to grow them. And then, of course, a sort of reasonable price point that reflects the value that people feel they get from the news in question, rather than just the sort of the needs of the publisher. Replacing print revenue is not a particularly compelling value proposition for me as a citizen. That might be very attractive for a publisher, but there's not really an argument for why I should pay. Covering my cost, pricing on cost is a terrible approach. So what we've seen in other markets is that even in the most successful markets, it takes years, sometimes decades, to build up a digital subscriber base. It doesn't happen overnight. It requires a real commitment and clarity of strategy from the publishers So it takes time, even in the most successful titles and even in the most successful markets. The growth of other forms of subscription and payment online, generally we find is an advantage for news publishers. It breaks with the so-called culture of free. Once people have paid for mobile games or for music streaming or for video streaming, it's a smaller step to also pay for news. So the sort of market conditioning and the reference prices are changing as people are taking up other subscriptions. And there, I would say the developments in India are very encouraging. If 100 million Indians are willing to pay, allegedly, for subscription video on demand, then for those 100 million Indians, the step to also paying for digital news is much smaller. Now, of course, they will also have expectations. And if you can get Disney Plus Hotstar for 500 rupees a year, then you might be surprised to be quoted the same for a month of a digital subscription of a newspaper, which, let's be real, is probably less valuable for a lot of people than a year's worth subscription to video. So I think there are some opportunities in this space, and I think there is some demand and some willingness to pay, but it's also very easy for me to sit in Oxford and tell other people to bet the farm on something that really does require a long-term commitment and the willingness to sort of keep a cool head in a situation where growth will be incremental and take time and will require sort of constant refinement of the approach to make it work in the market and for the audience that a publisher is targeting.
Yes, I agree with you. It takes time, but then it is good not only for your reader revenue, it's also good for your advertising revenue, because you are building a community of loyal customers, and the advertisers recognize that as well. So yeah, it's a long journey, but really worth. Rasmus, thank you very much. So I really look forward to have the evolution for next year. So and thank you very much. And I've put the links of the report, this one and another one I love, which is the one from Nick Newman, the Digital Trends 2022, on the chat. So yeah, so it's available for you. You should really look at them. It's very useful. Thank you, Rasmus. See you soon.